Doom Eternal is the sequel to the out-of-nowhere surprise hit that was Doom 2016. A return to form for the once legendary id Software, Doom showed us a new take on what a first-person shooter campaign could be, and it was rather glorious. So now, 4 years later, the expectations are high for Eternal. Can it live up to the now legendary 2016 game, and how can it expand on what was already so well established? Doom was always going to be a hard act to follow. Every time I revisit that game, I'm always surprised at how complete every part of it feels, how much each aspect complements the whole. You'd never know that it was a game that suffered from a long, messy development history. It expertly balanced the mix of frantic, hard-hitting combat with relaxed exploration of the game's massive, complicated maps. The story and tone walked perfectly on the edge between too goofy and too serious, and it did away with many of the expected tropes of a first-person shooter. There was no reloading, no real cutscenes, the main character didn't want to listen to the story, and it emphasized push-forward combat instead of hiding behind cover. In the 4 years it's been since the game released, Doom has become somewhat legendary, so going into Doom Eternal, my expectations were high. I was mildly curious to see what they'd do with the story and tone of the game. I was hoping for better variety in the visuals of the levels and less repetition in the back third, but when it came down to it, all I wanted from Eternal, at minimum, was a game that was as fun to play as Doom. Thankfully, in the areas that matter most, levels and gameplay, Doom Eternal is simultaneously as good as Doom 2016 and so much more. While aspects of the peripheral pieces of Doom Eternal are lesser, the heart of it is better than I could have ever hoped for. To put it simply, I think Doom Eternal's combat might be the best first-person shooter combat I've ever played. Ever. Full stop. I'm more than a little bit shocked at how good the combat is, how much it's been improved and expanded upon, and that a single-player combat system against AI in a shooter can be this much fun. I grew up primarily on Halo and have always loved a shooter where every enemy type feels and looks unique and where each encounter can play out 1,000 different ways because of the gameplay sandbox. Doom 2016 was certainly good in this regard, great in fact for the most part. But Eternal introduces a slew of new demons, reworks all the returning ones, gives the player way more tools to use, and then balances them all so precisely to create a practically perfect combat dance that never stopped being heart-pumping and absolutely exhilarating. Very quickly in Eternal, you're given everything you had in the 2016 game, like the double jump and the chainsaw, but then you're also given new toys like a dash ability, which lets you zip around faster than ever. You're also given the flame belch, which is a shoulder-mounted flamethrower that sets demons ablaze, and when you damage or kill them, they drop armor. Then there's the blood punch, a powerful melee attack that charges up and can be unleashed in a tight spot, and the grenades have been reworked and now offer the very useful ice bomb that freezes demons in place. All of this is dumped on you in the first 90 or so minutes of the game, and it'll take a while for you to adapt to using them all, but once you do, Eternal's combat systems all snap into place. Unfortunately, the game dishes this all out a little too quickly, I think. The entire opening hour or so is a bit rough and a noticeable step back from the legendary opening of Doom 2016. You're just sort of dropped right in the thick of things and given some basic bland tutorials about all the abilities you have, including some brief tutorials that take place in a lifeless gray box environment, which I'm never a fan of. There's also no indication whatsoever as to the nature of the story or what on earth has happened in the time since the ending of 2016. It's nowhere near as strong of a first impression as the last game. I had to bring up the opening because Doom's opening 30 minutes or so is one of the all-time great openings in gaming, and Eternal really misses the mark here. There's fantastic visuals and scale right off the bat in Eternal, and for me, the combat started to click into place very quickly, but the whole opening didn't really hit me and hype me up in the way that the 2016 opening did, and still does to this day. Anyways, with all these new tools now in your very capable demon-killing hands, it starts to quickly become clear that Doom Eternal's combat is a rather different beast than 2016's. Eternal is built to get you to utilize everything you have, every tool and every weapon. Where 2016 was complacent with letting you run through the entire game like I did, using the super shotgun, regular shotgun, and rocket launcher, Eternal simply refuses to let you do that. In Eternal, you have less ammo in every gun, and enemies are weak or resistant to certain weapons, including having weak spots that are easily hit using specific attacks. On top of that, armor and health drops are lessened throughout, some enemies move far faster than anything in the last game, and most enemies have both long and short range attacks. What it all means is that to succeed in Doom Eternal, you need to move constantly, shoot more deliberately, time your chainsaw and flame attacks carefully, all to manage resources on the fly and stay on top of the battle. Doom 2016 was obviously like this to a degree, especially on a higher difficulty, but it really does feel like Eternal has been redesigned from the ground up to make sure that no matter what difficulty you play on, you need to take full advantage of your arsenal and tools. I played through the game on ultraviolence, one notch up from normal, and the result was every single combat encounter in the entire game feeling like I was on the edge of my seat, playing as well as I could, managing to stay on top of it all. If I blinked even once, it would all start to fall apart, resulting in my death. It was 16 hours of exhausting combat where when every encounter ended, it felt like I'd been holding my breath. I've never felt that way consistently about combat in a first-person shooter before, and I absolutely adored it. Eternal isn't just a rebalancing of the Doomslayer's toolkit though. The enemies have also been completely rethought. There's a slew of new enemies to deal with, of course, but every returning enemy has also seen substantial changes. Essentially now, every enemy in the game has distinct attacks, weaknesses, and purpose. Again, on paper, this doesn't sound terribly dissimilar from the last game, but in practice, every enemy has been so deliberately fine-tuned that they all feel completely new. It made me think of a From Software game in a sense. As you play and learn their games, every enemy feels unique. You learn to respect their lethality no matter how small they may seem. You learn their moveset, their weaknesses, and over the course of the many encounters, they all become manageable. This is the same for Doom Eternal. Every enemy feels meticulously rethought and designed. They all have a role to play, they are all dangerous, but they also all have weaknesses. It's rare to see the enemies get this much care and attention in a first-person shooter. It's this constant push-pull with all the enemies, in tandem with the perfectly balanced toolkit, that let Doom Eternal rise above every other shooter I've played. In every encounter, the game is asking you to make hundreds of micro-decisions in a way that most shooters don't. Then you combine all of that with your now dramatically enhanced mobility alongside the enhanced mobility of the enemies, and every encounter is you making hundreds of micro-decisions while also zipping around at 200 miles an hour. There's a consistent nuance and thoughtfulness to maintaining this balance that keeps up all the way through Eternal. Doom 2016 was certainly doing all these things I have just described, but it was never doing it as well and as consistently as Eternal is doing it. It was very easy to fall into a pattern in Doom. In Eternal, the pattern becomes use everything, always. The back third of 2016 also became a bit of a drag because of this. Combat arena after combat arena started to blend together as I ran around using my favorite 3 weapons. 2016 also gave you too much BFG ammo and too often placed power-ups in the arenas to make things even easier. Eternal makes the BFG a true emergency button with extremely limited ammo, and as for power-ups, they're mostly absent throughout the game. Game developers finding ways to make sure players use all the cool systems they designed has been a consistent talking point for me throughout this generation. It mainly comes to mind with immersive sims, games like Alien Isolation, Dishonored, Breath of the Wild, Prey, Hitman, but it also very much applies to something like Bloodborne or Doom. Some of these games are much better at getting me to use all the cool toys I have, others not so much. In Doom 2016, I never needed to use half of the weapons I had because I never ran out of ammo, and every enemy died to my shotgun and rocket launcher just fine. I'd sometimes use all the weapons I had, cycling through them after each enemy, but I did that to keep the game feeling fresh to me, not because I needed to. I was basically forcing myself to use all the weapons to stop myself from getting bored in replays. The game was fine with me using the shotgun from beginning to end, much like how Bloodborne was fine with me using the Hunter's Axe from minute 1 to hour 40. Doom Eternal really set out to solve that problem and absolutely succeeds. You simply cannot use your favorite 3 guns from beginning to end in Eternal, and you simply cannot ignore your equipment. And this is where Doom Eternal is most interesting to me, because I think there are going to be players that really don't like that approach. I do think there are going to be people who adored Doom 2016 and who come to Eternal and have a bad time because the game is so much more demanding of you. It's asking you to be so much more on top of things. I never would have expected that going in, and while I am sympathetic to those for whom the game doesn't click, I am so glad these changes in philosophy and design were made. These changes are what make Eternal so great to play. It's why I've spent this long talking about it. Gameplay is the king with Doom, and I really do think the gameplay experience in Doom Eternal is the best I've had in a shooter. Now, 20 minutes ago or whenever, before I started ranting about how good the gameplay is, the other thing I mentioned that Doom Eternal did as well as Doom 2016 were the levels. Eternal has the same great, sprawling, complex, interconnected level design you know and love, jam-packed with tons of secrets and collectibles, and it's as enjoyable as ever to explore every nook and cranny to find them. There's also a larger emphasis placed on platforming in Eternal. You can now swing off of poles and grab onto specific walls and climb around, alongside the new dash ability, which can also be used mid-air. I was slightly worried that these would feel overused or out of place, but they never overstay their welcome. The expanded platforming sections are mostly quite simple, yes, but they provide a welcome break from the exhausting combat. And the more complex platforming means that secrets are often better hidden and harder to access than before. The game also now offers the ability to fast travel within individual levels, meaning you can easily go back and find secrets you missed earlier in the level. It's a great new addition, but its execution is a bit strange. The fast travel only unlocks near the very end of the level, usually like 10 feet before you finish the level, and the only notification you get is a really easy to miss blue pop-up on the left-hand side. It took me playing the first few levels to get used to when the fast travel notification would pop up, which made the early levels a little more frustrating because while you can replay any level, fast travel is not unlocked in the replay. It only ever unlocks when you are at the very end of a level. It's a relatively small problem that would be solved by just offering fast travel in replays, or a much more obvious notification when you are about to finish the level. I'm not sure why the game is so precious about this fast travel aspect. If there was one complaint I had about the levels in Doom 2016, it's that visually they were very, very similar. 2016 is an absolutely gorgeous game, of course, but every level is either a sci-fi industrial metal room or an orange-brown deserty hellscape. Thankfully, Doom Eternal steps things up massively in this regard. Basically, every single level feels completely unique from the last, and very few levels feel even remotely visually similar. I've limited my footage here to the first half of the game or so as to not spoil anything, but suffice it to say that the locations really go to some wild places. Again, this is something that fans of 2016 might be a little put off by. Historically, Doom is all about Mars and Earth and Hell. Eternal certainly goes to Earth and Hell, but it also goes into much more elaborate and imaginative sci-fi fantasy locales, along with being far more creative in the more familiar locations like Earth and Hell. It really is staggering just how meticulously detailed and complex and varied every environment in Doom Eternal is. The artists at id Software have stepped things up so much that it's honestly kind of shocking. Clearly, they wanted to flex their artistic muscles after being a little tame in 2016, and the results are just glorious. The sense of scale and density in many of these levels completely blows the prior game out of the water. I really can't speak highly enough to just how great the game looks from beginning to end. So where does Doom Eternal not quite deliver? Well, like I said earlier, it's basically all just in the peripheral parts, primarily in the story, honestly. I won't spend much time here because, let's be honest, most people, and myself included, were not playing Doom for the story. But one of the many surprising aspects of Doom 2016 was how well it handled the presentation of story and writing. The game was great at dismissing common shooter story tropes like cutscenes and characters talking in your ear all the time. It also managed to strike a rather perfect tone that landed right smack in the middle between too serious and too goofy. It's an incredibly hard balancing act, and 2016 pulled it off flawlessly, while also doing fun stuff with the story of the Doomslayer and throwing in some really top-notch corporate satire. Doom Eternal, as most sequels tend to be, is way more over the top, and for the most part, I'm fine with that. I think id Software knows what they're doing with the tone in Eternal, and I do enjoy a lot of the goofiness present here still. It's more the fact that the game now has more in the way of traditional shooter tropes like cutscenes and chatter in your ear. Thankfully, none of it ever gets in the way. The cutscenes are all brief and mostly just bookend the levels, and a few of them are honestly quite fun. The same can be said for the chatter in your ear. I would just have liked to have seen them execute their story stuff as confidently and effortlessly as it was in Doom 2016. Those small touches were important to Doom's brilliance, and them not being as good in Eternal is a disappointment, albeit a small one. The worst aspect of the story stuff is mainly just that there's so much more of it, and it's so much more in your face in the form of locations and cutscenes. I have no idea what happened between Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal, and having read the lore entries in Eternal, I still have very little idea of what's going on or where these crazy locations are or why I'm here or what's happening in the cutscenes. But again, honestly, it's not that big of a deal, right? There will be some that are here for the story in Doom. I am not one of them, and I reckon most aren't. Another thing that irks me a bit is the game trying to be a little bit of a live service game by having a form of battle pass-like progression for cosmetics and the inclusion of daily, weekly, monthly in-game challenges. Thankfully, none of it is monetized, and it's all just there in the menus, and in the current form, it is completely harmless. It's just not really something that feels like it adds to the game at all. If it wasn't in the game, I wouldn't be talking about it, and we'd be probably better off. I really hope that they don't try to monetize it by adding more battle passes and paid weapon skins in the future, but let's be honest, they're probably going to, and that's a shame. Doom just doesn't need that stuff. Doom also doesn't need a multiplayer mode, I don't think. This game has a multiplayer, but it's completely different from the first game. This time around, it's a far more imaginative thing where 2 players control demons and 1 player is the Slayer. The demons can spawn lesser enemies and attack the Slayer, and when one side kills the other, the round ends. First to 3 rounds wins. I only played 3 games of it, and in every single one of the matches, the Slayer just absolutely easily cleaned the floor, and I really didn't have a good time with it, even when I won as the Slayer. It's just not very fun. I mean, it's fine, I think, maybe? It's better than the multiplayer in 2016, but I just don't think Doom needs multiplayer of any kind. And I know that 99% of people only care about the single player experience, but the multiplayer is a part of the game, so I thought I'd very quickly mention it. Doom Eternal also lacks in great boss fights. Doom 2016 had several boss fights that did a surprisingly great job of using your movement abilities and different weapon attacks. I don't really like boss fights in any game, and even I was able to enjoy the boss fights in 2016. Eternal only has a couple of boss fights in it, and only one of them takes any advantage of your tools and feels like a fight from 2016. Most of the other fights are just mini boss fights against enemies that are in fact just regular enemies being introduced to the enemy pool. The final 2 fights, while great on spectacle, are mechanically dull and uninspiring, which is a shame. I was actually looking forward to the boss fights in Doom Eternal, and they were mostly a letdown. A few other small things worth mentioning. One of them, the fonts in this game are weirdly hard on my eyes. It's a very specific thing, I know, and I can't really nail what's up with them, but I think it's the font and the green backgrounds. I don't know. Anyways, they're ugly and I don't like them and they hurt my eyes. And there's a lot of lore entries and whatever. The game is also mostly very polished and bug-free, but I did see enemies getting stuck on parts of the environments more than a few times. And at one point I did encounter a progression bug where a door didn't open, but upon reloading the checkpoint I was actually placed on the proper side of the door, so it wasn't much of a problem. It's worth mentioning though. Both of these are listed as known issues, so hopefully they won't be around for too long. As a whole though, it's an incredibly polished experience. A couple of small positives to quickly mention. I love the new Marauder enemy. I'm not going to show him, I don't think, because he's a fun surprise, but it feels like he's from a different game in a way that really surprised me and actually worked for me. He's going to be an enemy you either love or absolutely hate, and it seems like most people absolutely hate him, which I can understand. He's very tough and aggressive, and I had a very good time fighting him. The new demon gore tech is also fantastic. Basically, every demon now breaks apart with every shot fired at them, and it really helps make the guns feel way more powerful this time around. There are also some great and very funny sound effects throughout the game. I love the headshot pop sound, and I love the Cacodemon gulp. They've really improved their sound design across the board here, actually. And of course, the music is as metal and savage as ever. The OST for Eternal isn't out yet, so I can't say if there's anything in it that is as incredible as the BFG Division track from 2016, but there are some very good pieces of music to be found throughout Eternal. And parts of the soundtrack really deviate from what was established in 2016 in some really neat ways. There's a lot of guttural voice work in the soundtrack, or ethereal humming at times, which really set the tone for some of the more bizarre locations you visit. There's a lot to say about Doom Eternal, more than I was expecting, and I'm glad that that's the case. It is, of course, not nearly as surprising as the last game, and it lacks the effortless balancing of tone, but the act of playing has never been better. Doom Eternal is a different beast, a more demanding one. It's a game that asks more of you, one that isn't interested in letting you relax and run and gun. It's a game that practically demands that you play it the way it was designed. Thankfully, what id Software has so meticulously designed and balanced results in the most mechanically satisfying and enjoyable first-person shooter I think that I've ever played. Doom Eternal is big, gorgeous, and it absolutely kicks ass.